Hello. Hi, welcome. Um, I want to make sure with you guys, because it feels as if, I don't know, I'm getting a sense of deja vu. Have we not covered Roosevelt's New Deal yet? Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal?
I don't remember.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, that's okay. Thank you, Marisol. Um, I uh I'm gonna work from there. Okay. For one, I don't have it posted yet, which is not good. Um, And so I will certainly rectify that today or tonight. Um, but I'm going to assume from there, from that fact alone, that we have not. It's just such a strange sense that I have. It just it feels like I've just covered that. But at any rate, um, let's see. We get the names down for extra credit. All right. Um, so in covering this one, right, what we're going to look at is a bit of great man history. Right? We're going to focus a lot on Roosevelt himself as the president and the main figurehead connected to a program that he very generically termed a New Deal for the country to try to pull us out of the Depression. All right. And what I do is just in my years as a student, getting different interpretations. Okay, good. So the 1930s. Thank you. That's perfect. Then that makes sense because that's when the New Deal predominantly occurred. It's in the 1930 after 1932. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with the New Deal assignment. All right. So on this, okay, President Roosevelt, he came in 1932, and he uh, he won by a landslide. He won by a landslide. His predecessor, Herbert Hoover, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, uh, turnarounds, 4-year alteration in presidential history. Hoover won overwhelmingly in 28, and he lost overwhelmingly in 32. So just in those 4 years. But of course, you had the onset of the Great Depression. And with the Great Depression, you have, standard interpretations as to what may have caused uh, it. So, for one, right, is banking. Banking was irresponsible. Banks were taking people's deposits and speculating in the stock market. With the stock market itself, absolutely is. I'm sure you have read or seen on a documentary. The stock market was absolutely devoid of law and order. And a lot of people, for instance, were buying things on stock, um, are buying things on margin. So they were borrowing money to purchase stock, expecting for the stock value to rise, and thereupon deduct from their earnings, their profits, that which they had borrowed. Well, that works full well as long as your stock keeps increasing in value. But of course, it did not always continue to do such. And a lot of people were putting a lot of stock speculation into into products like automobiles that people are not going to buy every year. So they see the stock, go up with Ford, his Model Ts, automobiles, and the same number of people nowhere near are going to purchase a car the subsequent year. All right. Also, like in Trachtenberg's thesis, mechanization took on a life of its own. Machines producing things, and efficiency was the name of the game. Doing as many, producing as much as possible in a given time frame, and they just kept producing more and more in a lot of these factories. And such was the optimism that there was always going to be a willing person with a demand to purchase them. And remember, by demand, I don't just mean a desire to purchase them, but the actual financial means and capacity to buy them, right? So you're going to deal with overproduction and underconsumption, producing a lot more than people were able to buy. Okay, and then of course that's going to cause a chain reaction of laying off workers, and then when you lay off, thousands of workers, that's thousands of more people that are devoid of purchasing power, and so they now even more people are incapable of buying what is produced in the market. And the same thing happened in dramatic fashion with farming. Farming was just going swimmingly in the 1920s, and farmers, a lot of them, they got in over their head. They got a little heady, a little arrogant, and expecting that type of prosperity to continue indefinitely. And so they would borrow to increase their lands and to put more and more of their land under cultivation. With certain crops in the Midwest, it was historically stated that you were to leave 1/3 of your land to lay fallow without cultivation to replenish the nitrogen and the other nutrients in the soil. And they got greedy and they stopped doing that. And they started, cultivating almost every square inch of their acreage. And so Europe bounced back. Europe bounced back from World War I and the International Monetary Fund and things that were helping Europe out. They got back on their feet. And in particular, by this time, you had one of the famous programs of the Bolshevik, the Bolsheviks in Russia, and in particularly in Lithuania and the Ukraine, etc. They became the well-working breadbasket for the Soviet Union and for the rest of Europe. And so they didn't need our wheat anymore. They could purchase the wheat from the Ukraine and from other places in the Soviet Union instead. And so we put up tariff walls. And so the European countries put up tariff walls in retaliation. And so when we tried to desperately sell things in Europe, including especially farm products, they stopped purchasing them. And then, of course, the Depression hit here, and people didn't have the purchasing power to buy corn, even milk, eggs, etc. And so they were ironically dumping them, and getting rid of them, and having no while people were starving, beginning to starve throughout the country. William Leuchtenberg's book on the New Deal and FDR, I quote his thesis, or I paraphrase it pretty soon here. His intro and on the misery of the Great Depression is very telling of how miserable everything became. But you have all these factors and then some. And then Americans were spending beyond their means. Like I said, I have a stat from somewhere where it was like well over 80% of Americans by the end of the 1920s had zero in savings. They were just spending everything they could. And then there was a considerable high ratio of Americans who were indebted to credit, because credit became popular in the 1920s. So it was just a myriad of factors that all kind of coalesced and forming the worst depression we've ever had up to date. And so, as you may know, unemployment nationally went up to a quarter of the population, 25%. And in some places, especially places where virtually the whole city were employed by Henry Ford, etc. Toledo, Ohio, they had depression up at 90%, 9 out of 10 unemployed. And so this was a major issue. And so it's ironic that the president, Herbert Hoover, was of pretty poor Midwestern origins himself. So he should have been able to relate well to the common people and having been born, in that stratum. But instead, right, as making it as a big engineer and worker for oil tycoons, and then a bureaucrat who was good at math, he supposedly got out of touch with the people, and his public image could not have been worse. There were times where the Depression was really getting miserable. Lots of people at public parks, public streets that were homeless, evicted from their homes, and bread lines, waiting for free meal. And he has his picture taken at a gala, and he's wearing a tuxedo and he's smiling with his hair slicked, and he's got a cigar in his mouth, and he's got champagne next to him, eating his steak dinner. And so he didn't do well in making an image of compassion, concern, connection with the people, because he seemed to be just fine and somewhat aloof to what the people were going through. And then there was a bonus army, World War I vets, who demanded that they get their stipends from the war sooner than established prior, because of the emergency of the circumstances, right? They wanted it now rather than waiting to a certain age, a certain year. And the administration under Hoover was just very matter of fact, very by the book. And they said, sorry, we made an agreement. An agreement was made with what year you're going to get that stipend, and you're not getting it now. So they tried to march on Washington. And a lot of those who were marching, according to the press, were families, not just the veterans, but the veterans brought their wives and children, etc., to march with them. And so when they got to, the Pennsylvania Avenue and began trying to walk down it, the administration sent tanks after them, tear gas. Some began beating people with the batons, and in some cases actually fired shots, and a handful of people were killed. And that, to a lot of people, was the death nail. That was the last nail shutting the coffin politically for Herbert Hoover. So in 32, right, when he's running for re-election, he runs against this relatively new face from New York, Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, a lot of people use the term for him, ebullient, or something like that. I just know how it's spelled, not how it's pronounced. But at any rate, it's like it's bubbling with joy, mirth, goodness, joviality, etc. And so that he was described as such. And he generically told people on his campaign, his election campaign, that he had a new deal for the country, something different, right, to help get the American people out of it. And at any rate, we're going to get more into the details now, but that's what you have here. You have his picture there. So President Franklin Roosevelt, praised as an idealistic and revolutionary president. All right. So remember, idealistic, I just keep that simple in my head. Just, you don't see the world as it is, you see it as it ought to be. You want to provide some type of revolutionary improvement to mankind, to human institutions, culture, etc., right? That you want to bring some type of improved change. Okay. So that's one look. That's one way. If you look at some of the biographies on this man and the depictions of the New Deal, Some will praise it. Remember, they call this court history, right? Praising our nation's leaders and contending just that about this man. Well, what was revolutionary about it? Okay, well, let's see here. For one, okay, is no one had such direct involvement in many like mainstream industries, right? Of resolving um, resolving supply and demand, price issues, workers' conditions, etc. No one to the degree of Roosevelt up to this time, Franklin. All right. So for one, right, he had the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. And what they did is they would get together with the leaders of different industries and farming, right? So peaches, corn, whatever it might be. They would decide what the relative demand was nationally, right? The ability to pay for that product. And they would see oftentimes how the supply was woefully um, um, too much, right? So what they did is they subsidized farmers to grow less. They subsidized some farmers to um, switch crops. That was unheard of. Okay, the government telling farmers, I want you to switch from peaches to grapes, whatever it might be, and we're going to pay you to do so. Okay. And not only that, his choice of unofficial cabinet members, right? He knew largely that these people had too radical of a reputation to be ratified by the Senate, right, as his official cabinet members. So he just kept them there unofficially. One was Rex Tugwell. This guy had gone to Europe during the Great Depression and spoke well of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union about things that they were doing to combat unemployment, poverty, etc. Right? So you can imagine the type of criticism that Rex Tugwell would get when he came back, having written this. But Rex Tugwell was a part of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, right? Of trying to get people to change what they cultivated, how much of it, in line with demand, even set prices at times, etc. Matter of fact, there were a lot of components to it that looked like components that were included in the Soviet Union's collectivization of agriculture. Okay. Then they did the same thing with, I have it here somewhere, but they did the same thing with the urban industries, a very similar thing at least, and it was the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA. Everything was an acronym. Okay, with NIRA, the same thing. They met with industry leaders. They set prices. They brought down production to be more in line with demand. And for helping the bosses out, right? Because this was kind of a form of a bailout, right? Of the government helping them set prices. So then they didn't have to worry about competition throughout the industry. And this was clearly in violation of the antitrust acts, but the administration didn't care. Okay, another just kind of novel thing. And so, in response to helping out those who were in charge of these industries, right, they demanded that certain things be enacted to protect their workers, their laborers. Okay. So there was something called Section 7A. And in Section 7A, right, of NIRA, They established a minimum wage. They established workers' compensation for those hurt. They established um, the recognition of unions and their ability to engage in collective bargaining. Okay. And this is going to be solidified in Congress by way of the Wagner Act, the Wagner Act. And this basically was our first kind of, they called it the blanket code because, like a good blanket, it covered the major things, right? Providing a minimum wage across multiple industries, not all, but multiple industries, and so forth. The right to unionize, workers' comp, and all that. So at any rate, they did that, right? And this was kind of unheard of, doing these things. Then you go down to the Tennessee Valley Authority and the WPA. Okay. These two, right? They weren't the only two, but they're most well known. This provided direct work relief for the people. And so by work relief, right? Instead of the government making, like with public works, right? With freeways, bridges, etc. Instead of the historical method to use was to keep it localized, right? And at each locale, make an agreement between the city or the state and certain construction companies. The construction companies in turn hire whomever they want, pay them whatever they want, and they do the work, right? And that was the historical way of doing it. Now, the government is going to get rid of the middleman, the private construction companies. It's going to nationalize these programs across the states. And the federal government is going to directly give a job to millions of Americans. The WPA at any given time had 2.5 million workers working under it, getting paid by it. So as you can imagine, I mean, that hasn't happened since. That type of mass public works system, directly from the federal government down into the local areas of states. So the Tennessee Valley Authority, they allowed the workers to only keep a third of their salaries, at least at first. Only keep a third of their salaries because they were providing them. They had them in like military barracks, right? Where they provided lodging, food and water, etc. And so since their needs were taken care of in these camps, they were only allowed to keep a third of their salary. And the other 2/3 was to be mailed directly to their families. All right. And why is that? I want to get back to that. The Works Progress Administration, they oftentimes paid weekly because they wanted to regularly put money in the pockets of their workers. And they were paid for a myriad of things, from construction type work to theater, acting, sculpture, painting, playing music. There was a federal writers project with a history wing for writing history. They were just going out of their way to find work for a myriad of different people of different backgrounds and skills, right? And this was unheard of. So there's this economist right here, John Maynard Keynes. And this guy had a pretty simple theory that Franklin Roosevelt's administration seemed to adhere to. And that was, right, that one of, if not the first indicator of the health of an economy is the purchasing power of its people. And further than that, it is the government's responsibility to help facilitate and make that happen. People having purchasing power to spend. So remember the rhetoric, right? The whole paradigm was changing, because prior to this, it was all about capitalism, right? And with capitalism, you let the laws of human nature, the laws of economics, etc., do their thing, and government keep your hand out of the economy as much as possible. Now, this is a much more paternalistic view, right? Government, you need to actively get involved in the economy to help ensure the purchasing power of the average American. And that's John Maynard Keynes. Okay. And then one more radical thing about this, radical in the sense of being different, right? Switching the paradigm for the American federal government and economy, is the government was spending money that it didn't even have. It was spending itself further into debt, because the currency, we were taken off the gold standard. So then it's just fiat. It's just trust in the integrity of the government to hold forth the worth of the dollar. And so they began, just in some cases, just inflation, just printing more money, borrowing more money, etc., to pay workers, to pay for these programs, etc. Because the idea is you're priming the pump, right? That, yeah, make a mess right now, and in the short run, that's fine to get even further in debt as a nation, because you're getting the system going again and providing jobs and hence purchasing power to the American people. And once they go to the market and start spending their money, everything will pick back up. So they're okay with deficit spending. I already mentioned the Wagner Act. Okay, so oh, and another one I should have here somewhere is the TVA. Yeah, right here. And the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, is the federal government tinkered with gas and water socialism, or at least something close to it, whereby the federal government bought the rights from a private electric company at the Muscle Shoals Dam, and the federal government began creating hydroelectric power and providing it to the people in the South, right, on a as you can basis, right? And that's a different paradigm. So with gas and water socialism, it's the idea, right, that, okay, you I like to think of it almost as like diet socialism or diet Marxism, is you by and large agree that most things on the market ought to stay privatized. All right. But certain goods, services, you believe, okay, are not like the other products of a capitalist economy. If you can't buy a Rolls-Royce car, then you just don't get one. You're not entitled to one, right? The wealthy people have that option. And so hence you can't, always get what you want. But you decide that certain goods and services are a right, not something that some people can buy and others can't, but a God-given right that people should be entitled to. So for instance, like public transportation, water and electricity, garbage removal, etc. So with gas and water socialists, they believe the government ought to subsidize, ought to help provide this, if not for free, at least on an as you can basis. And so hence those, right, they would determine, I don't know how, about how much you could afford for your electric power, and the government would accept that, even though it wasn't as much as other people could pay and did pay. So that was very different, the government doing that. So on those bases, some people contend, and they choose to see it in a positive light, right? That this administration, we had never seen anything like it. It was novel, it was new, it was radical, it was revolutionary. And of course, to the uber conservatives, it was scary, right? Because it's moving away from libertarianism, right? Remember, libertarian is government don't tread on me, try to minimize government involvement in people's lives, less government. This was definitely not libertarian. Then number 2, court history. Depression era America benefited from President Franklin Roosevelt's personal transformation. So this one's less complex. It's pretty simple. In a lot of literary works, right, you have character development of your protagonist. And character development, right, is your main character improves as a human being from the beginning to the end of the book. And that's what you have here. So you have a early youthful image, okay? And I'm thinking of things like I'm thinking of H.W. Brands. Okay, he's a popular historian. He kind of took this image where you have a guy who was described as a dandy when he was young, as a born wealthy, spoiled rotten, cared only about himself and enjoying his wealth, handsome and followed women, and just everything that his relative Theodore Roosevelt initially in college wrote about hating. Because remember, we talked about that with the progressive image of Teddy Roosevelt. His self-image was that he thought if he was born well off, the least he can do was pay it forward and try to protect the poor and help lift them up. And he hated his Harvard roommates that only, the Romans would call it, tended their own garden. Tend your own garden is just that. You just you stay in your own house. You worry about your spouse and kids only, and the world could go to hell in a handbasket for all you care. That you're just into your own private life. Theodore Roosevelt hated that amongst rich people, and yet his relative Franklin kind of is depicted in that way in his early years. All right. And so then a couple of things happen. Is one is he contracted polio, right? He went to jump out of a yacht in the Atlantic Ocean and got a chill, couldn't feel his legs, thought it was something to do with how cold the Atlantic was, but he had done it several times before and hadn't had that, reaction. and had a doctor come to his home. One thing led to another. He became paralyzed and he had contracted polio. They were worried about him, that he might literally end his own life. He was so sullen for a while. And they said, almost miraculously, almost just very dramatically, he showed up for breakfast one morning with a smile on his face and said, basically in his own simple, comical way, that he'd accepted his fate and he was ready to move on with his life. When he had polio, he went down to Warm Springs, Georgia. Okay. And down at Warm Springs, there was a camp of children from across the country who had polio and were receiving during this camp free treatment, mainly warm water treatment. Okay. Well, according to multiple sources, he grew very pensive, right? Where he would get in deep thought, get lost in deep thought to himself, and also very gregarious. And gregarious, right, is more like his second cousin Teddy Roosevelt. Is you more like you like being around people, and you're the life of the party, etc. We have pictures of him in the pool with other paralyzed with kids playing water polo and other games in the pool with a big smile on his face. Well, he finds out at the end of that summer camp that the kids have to go back home because they don't have the money to stay there and continue receiving the treatment that he easily could with his money. Well, supposedly he was moved, and he told his mother he wanted some of the money of his inheritance from her because his father had died when he was young, and his father was one that was very rich. But his mom inherited it, his father's wealth. He said he wanted some of that wealth early. And he told his wife as well he was going to buy this Warm Springs resort in Georgia, and he was going to open it up for free for the kids with polio. And this supposedly is the beginning of a new Roosevelt, a guy who began to understand the suffering of the common people, even if his suffering was different, and began to become compassionate for others. The other factor that plays into this whole narrative of character development is his affiliation with Eleanor Roosevelt. See, Eleanor's father was the brother of Teddy Roosevelt and was the one that they put all their promise in more than Teddy. But he had a very self-destructive tendency, and he would quite often just leave his family, and they would find him on the streets despite his wealth, drunken with alcohol. He was an alcoholic. And so at any rate, he ended up dying young and hardly played any role at all in his daughter Eleanor's socialization growing up. The mom, for multiple reasons, didn't play much of a role for her daughter either. So her aunt, they knew her as Bammy. And all the sources I read about her, they call her Bammy, but that wasn't her real name. But whoever Bammy was, she was, one of her dad's sisters, Teddy Roosevelt's sister. You look at what Teddy Roosevelt wrote to her. He absolutely had the utmost respect for Bammy, his sister Bammy. He thought, they jokingly stated on multiple occasions that had Bammy just simply been born a male at that time period, she would have been the one in the family to become president before any of the others. So at any rate, Bammy was well read. She had embraced the progressive outlook. Remember, we talked about the progressives, the do-gooders, right? Of helping the marginalized, etc. So she instilled that into Eleanor. And so literally on one of the first dates that Eleanor had with Franklin, and yes, by the way, they were, I think it equated to, it was beyond second. It was at least like third to fifth cousin. So it was technically legal. Um, nothing like first cousins. But yeah, so Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt marry each other. And on one of the early dates, she brought him to a settlement house that she often volunteered in. And he came back and he wrote about and spoke about how heavily it supposedly influenced him, seeing the poverty of these immigrants and others that were in the settlement house, and what a great deal of altruism, of good, that the do-gooders were doing for them at this settlement house. So at any rate, their relationship, as you might know, on the one hand was sad, because Franklin Roosevelt had affairs. He may not have ever been exceptionally physically attracted to Eleanor, but they contend that there was no concern that he would ever want to divorce her, that he was crazy about her, that he respected her more than he respected any other woman, and that he would consult with her to a greater degree than most presidents have done with their wives. And so at any rate, she had a way of eliciting, right, bringing out a degree of depth within Roosevelt that a lot of people couldn't elicit. All right. So she brought the best out of him. The suffering experience of polio, and particularly the altruistic occasions of seeing settlement houses and seeing Warm Springs, Georgia children at the camp, softened his heart, humbled his heart, and primed him to be the compassionate leader that we needed. So one of the first things, I mean, you kind of go back to some of the same data. Some people contend that, the fact that he fought for a minimum wage and that blanket code in the Wagner Act, that showed deep concern for the industrial workers. The fact that he provided direct work relief through the WPA and the CCC, etc., demonstrated his compassion for the people and his desire to immediately, put money into their pockets. And then another thing, you could never know, I don't know how you could gauge and test to what extent it was, good acting, and to what extent it was genuine, were his chats, his fireside chats over the radio. They became famous. At one stage, he was given one every night of the week. And people, it was amazing how many people lost most of their furniture, their house, lost their vehicle, lastly would lose their house, but they would hold on to that radio. It was like supposedly their connection to humanity. It was their only escape from their misery, etc. So a lot of Americans, despite this being the Depression era, had radios to listen to him, supposedly. And he would just simply talk to them, right? And say, like, Good evening, America. It pains me to think that some of you had nothing to eat for dinner tonight. But I want to tell you that today I went to Congress and we're resolving this, that. We're coming through with this issue, that issue. They're going to vote on tomorrow, etc. So please hold on to your hope. Please go appeal to your local resources, as we are doing everything we can to subsidize your local resources. And he would just let them know that he was thinking about them every day. He was trying to resolve something for them every day. And he was constantly mindful, and he was not okay with their misery. All right. All right. Then number 3, William Leuchtenberg. Leuchtenberg's real simple thesis. This guy was not an idealist. He was a pragmatist. He didn't have a set ideological agenda for the country. He was a typical politician and wanting to do whatever brought about the most beneficial, quick political results. So one of the biggest examples he uses in his book is his official cabinet members versus his unofficial cabinet members. His official cabinet members, Henry Wallace, etc., they were relatively, for that time period, conservative. And so, of course, they were easily passed by the Senate. Okay. And then what he would do is he'd have a dinner and he would introduce his official cabinet member, right, whatever department it was, with his unofficial cabinet member, right, who most of the time, like I said, most of the time, the official one was pretty conservative and the unofficial one was a little bit more radical, maybe more to the left. And he would ask them questions about what they thought about this and that was pertinent to some of his plans for the country, right? In the Depression. And they would almost invariably disagree with each other. He would laugh and then suddenly get serious and say, I want you to come to an agreement with some type of plan to deal with unemployment, to deal with overproduction and underconsumption in textiles or whatever it might be. And so he would make them try to hammer out an agreement. And in the rare cases where they just downright refused, they both dig in their heels and they wouldn't compromise. They would each give the president a separate solution, a separate plan, right? Well, he supposedly would write both of them down and he would open up a press conference and he would begin asking the members of the press in front of his table, what would you think of this type of plan? And he wouldn't give all the details. He'd be more generic, but give enough, right, to be fitting for the program that was promoted by either the radical or the official representative of his. When it was clear that the press stated that people will not have that's too radical of a change, etc., then most of the time he would scrap that idea. if they even gave him some hope that it would be palatable, that the American and Republic would consume it, would accept it, then he would give it a go. And he oftentimes, when he was bringing forth a program, he would want to congratulate the author of that program, give credit to him or her, right? And then he would see how it would turn out. And guess what? If it didn't go well, if the public didn't accept it well, then that person that he praised took the fall for it. He could throw that person under the bus, right? And then if it did well, he would still, as president, be praised for that other person's idea. He also states, look at the campaign program of 32. And he gives examples, you guys, that are a little bit comical. One city, he says, we need to cut government spending, right, before he's president. Then the other one, he says, no, we need to enlarge government involvement in farming. He would go back and forth on his word from one city to the next. But he never mentioned anything about public works, the government directly, right, giving a job to millions of Americans and paying them weekly. He never said anything about deficit spending, spending money that they didn't have, right, to prime the pump and put money in the pockets of Americans. A lot of his most radical contributions, right, laws, programs, etc., that he would be responsible for, a part of, after 32, after he was elected, most of those, he gave no clue of them in this 32 campaign. Now, some people would contend that he knew those programs would not be accepted, people hearing it, that he wanted to sneak them in, right, after getting elected in 32. But Leuchtenberg doesn't buy that. Leuchtenberg thinks he hadn't thought of those ideas. Those ideas hadn't been brought to him yet. This guy didn't know what he stood for when he was running in 32. He just knew that his Harvard buddies, including Rex Tugwell, were smarter and better read than he was. And he didn't care if they were left or right on the political spectrum. He just wanted ideas that would work, that would help unemployment, help overproduction and underconsumption, and the major issues, help farming with these issues, right? Because that in turn would help him get reelected as a popular president who got us out of the Great Depression. And some of you may know he is going to run for president and win 4 times. It's the only president who's ever done that. And you could easily guess his rationale, especially when World War II erupts, that you don't change drivers, right? You don't change pilots in a time of emergencies. So anyway, that's the thesis of Leuchtenberg. All right. Now, please, okay? Let's see what I have written here. Please note that the instructor never pretends to personally adhere to any of these arguments. I deliberately create slanted accounts to sharpen your critical thinking skills, and I expect you to critically discover fallacies of logic, manipulation of facts, and or exceedingly narrow perspectives. How much more, therefore, do I disassociate myself from the following provocative thesis? Very much so. All right. So I'm letting you know, okay, as even going further than showing that I'm not that this doesn't necessarily represent my personal belief. I'm even going further than that here in my introduction, my disclaimer, right? I'm pretty much telling you that I don't even adhere to this thesis. I don't. I'm telling you that I don't personally. I don't necessarily believe this, but there's enough thought-provoking, curious data that I think is worth putting out there. So I almost kind of did it, like I said, strategically for your critical thinking, but also for fun. Is that Pearl Harbor was anticipated, we knew of it, and we deliberately allowed it to happen so that it would awaken in the American people enough indignation toward Japan that they would support our involvement in the war. As opposed to the old standard interpretation, right? That we were arrogant, that we were sloppy, and we were caught sleeping with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm not gonna give the data on that one. I want you guys to read it for yourselves. Like I said, I think it's enough to be curious, to be interesting. But I don't personally adhere to it. At least not yet. All right, so are there any questions about any of these? All right, any thumbs up? You guys feel relatively prepared for this? And I'll post it tonight, okay? Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Kaylin. Stephanie, thanks. All right. Well, great. All right, well, I wish you well. I have your names down. You'll get your extra credit. You guys have a great remainder of the week.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too, hon. Thank you.
Did my name get recorded? This is the first time I'm trying it for my phone.
Alex, I do. I have it.
Perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Good to have you. Thank you, Marisol.